April 22nd, 1519. The coastal plains of Veracruz, New Spain. When Aztec ambassadors returned to Tenochtitlan, after their first encounter with Hernán Cortés's expedition, they brought something more terrifying than tales of thundersticks or floating mountains. They brought descriptions of creatures from nightmare. Massive armor-plated beasts that stood as tall as a man's chest, with jaws that could crush bone, and a hunger that could only be satisfied with human flesh. The Spanish called them perros de guerra, war dogs. But these weren't mere animals accompanying soldiers. These were weapons, calculated, trained, and systematically deployed instruments of terror. Mastiffs and greyhounds bred for generations to hunt, conditioned to see indigenous people as prey, rewarded with the flesh of prisoners. The Aztec codices would later record them as tzitzimitl, demons made flesh. But the truth was far more terrifying than any myth could capture before we uncover the truth about the conquistador war dogs and how Cortés weaponized armored mastiffs to shatter an empire. Make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers scattered across the globe. Now, let's descend into one of history's most calculated campaigns of psychological warfare. The year 1519 marked a collision between worlds that would reshape human civilization forever. In Spain, the Reconquista had concluded just 27 years earlier. For centuries, Iberian kingdoms had fought to reclaim territory from Moorish rule, and that prolonged conflict had forged a particular Spanish military culture, one that prized cavalry, heavy armor, and an especially brutal auxiliary force, war dogs. These weren't the companions we know today. These were alanos and mastines, dogs bred from ancient Molosser stock, standing over 30 inches at the shoulder, weighing upward of 150 pounds, with jaw pressure that could shatter a human femur. Spanish conquistadors hadn't invented the war dog. Ancient Assyrians, Persians, and Romans had all deployed canines in combat. But the Spanish had perfected something darker. Dogs specifically trained to hunt human beings. During the Reconquista and the subsequent subjugation of the Canary Islands, Spanish forces had refined techniques for using dogs against populations they deemed inferior. The dogs were trained from puppyhood to recognize specific ethnic features, conditioned to attack indigenous people while ignoring European handlers. Across the Atlantic, the Aztec Empire stood at its apex. Tenochtitlan, with a population exceeding 200,000, was larger than any European city save Constantinople. The Triple Alliance controlled tribute from millions across Mesoamerica. The Aztecs possessed advanced agriculture, monumental architecture, sophisticated astronomy, and a military tradition that had conquered dozens of neighboring states. But they had never encountered dogs. Mesoamerica had no large domesticated mammals. The Aztecs kept small, nearly hairless dogs called xoloitzcuintli as companions, and occasionally as food, but these animals weighed perhaps 20 pounds. The concept of a beast large enough to knock a warrior to the ground, strong enough to tear through cotton armor, vicious enough to consume human flesh, this existed only in their mythology. When Hernán Cortés departed Cuba in February 1519 with 11 ships, he brought approximately 550 Spanish soldiers, 16 horses, and at least 20 war dogs. The horses would terrify the Aztecs, but the dogs would traumatize. Cortés understood something fundamental about conquest. Before you can defeat an enemy's armies, you must shatter their psychological certainty. The Aztecs believed themselves militarily superior to any force they might encounter. They had sophisticated battle tactics, numerical advantage, and fighting traditions refined over generations. Cortés had cannons, steel, horses, and war dogs, none of which the Aztecs had ever faced. The first encounters would not be battles. They would be demonstrations, and the dogs would feast. Incident 1, the Tabasco demonstration, March 25th, 1519. The first recorded deployment of war dogs against indigenous Americans occurred near the Grijalva River, in what is now Tabasco. Cortés's expedition had encountered resistance from the Chontal Maya people. After a brief battle, the Battle of Centla, in which Spanish cavalry and firearms had already shocked the Maya warriors, Cortés ordered a demonstration. According to Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who documented the conquest, Cortés had several captured Maya warriors brought before the assembled indigenous leaders who had come to negotiate. The Spanish commander gave a signal. Handlers released a massive alano named Becerrillo. The dog, wearing a quilted cotton vest that protected its torso, charged the prisoners with practiced precision. Witnesses described how the animal targeted the throat first, collapsing a warrior to the ground before the man could even scream. The dog then systematically attacked a second prisoner, tearing at the legs and groin, areas where cotton armor provided minimal protection. The Maya chiefs watched in paralyzed horror. They had seen men die in battle countless times. But this was different. This was a beast that attacked with purpose, that seemed to derive pleasure from the hunt, that didn't kill quickly but methodically, savagely. Cortés let the attack continue for nearly 2 minutes before calling Becerrillo off. The dog obeyed instantly, sitting at its handler's side while blood dripped from its muzzle. One prisoner was dead. The other would die from his injuries within hours. The demonstration achieved its purpose. The Maya immediately sued for peace, offering tribute and provisions. But more importantly, they spread word of the Spanish war beasts to every settlement and city-state in the region. By the time Cortés reached Aztec territory, his reputation had preceded him. Incident 2. The Feeding, April 1519. As Cortés established his base at Villarrica de la Vera Cruz, he faced a logistical challenge, maintaining his war dogs' aggression and conditioning. War dogs weren't simply released to attack. They required constant training to maintain their ferocity and their specific targeting of indigenous people. Spanish handlers used a technique they had perfected in the Caribbean islands. They would stage regular hunts using indigenous prisoners. But these weren't quick executions. The handlers deliberately injured prisoners, hamstringing them or breaking their legs, then released them for the dogs to pursue. The dogs learned to track wounded prey, to follow blood scent, to anticipate how injured humans would move. Contemporary accounts from Spanish soldiers describe these training sessions with disturbing casualness. Diego de Landa, though writing primarily about later Yucatan campaigns, noted that handlers would exercise the dogs with Indians, as a man might hunt rabbits. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who became the most prominent critic of Spanish atrocities, documented that dogs were fed on the flesh of Indians, as both reward and conditioning. The Aztec ambassadors who visited the Spanish camp in late April witnessed these feedings. They saw handlers toss chunks of flesh to the dogs. They saw the animals fighting over the remains, and they understood, with mounting horror, that these beasts ate people. When the ambassadors returned to report to Emperor Moctezuma II, they described the dogs in terms usually reserved for supernatural entities. The Florentine Codex, compiled decades later from Aztec accounts, records their words. Their dogs are enormous, with flat ears and long, dangling tongues. The color of their eyes is a burning yellow, their eyes flash fire and shoot off sparks. Their bellies are hollow, their flanks long and narrow. They are tireless and very powerful. They bound here and there, panting, with their tongues hanging out. But the Codex also records something more chilling. They feed on people's flesh. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The Aztecs practiced ritual sacrifice and had complex relationships with death, but their sacrificial victims were honored warriors or tribute, killed in religious ceremonies with specific purposes. The dogs represented something different, arbitrary, bestial consumption of human flesh as mere sustenance. It violated fundamental Aztec concepts about death, honor, and the human body. Incident 3, the Cholula Massacre, October 18, 1519. By October, Cortés had formed alliances with several indigenous groups hostile to Aztec rule, most notably the Tlaxcalans. His combined force, now numbering several thousand indigenous allies alongside his Spanish troops, approached the sacred city of Cholula, home to one of Mesoamerica's most important temples. What happened in Cholula remains disputed, but the outcome is documented. Spanish forces, claiming they had uncovered a plot to ambush them, massacred between 3,000 and 30,000 Cholulan civilians over 2 days. The war dogs played a central role. According to multiple Spanish accounts, Cortés ordered his forces to surround the main plaza where Cholulan nobility had gathered. At a prearranged signal, Spanish soldiers opened fire while simultaneously releasing the war dogs into the panicked crowd. The dogs had been trained for precisely this scenario. They didn't attack randomly. Handlers had conditioned them to target specific individuals, those wearing elite clothing and symbols of authority. The dogs lunged for throats and faces, aiming to disfigure and kill high-status individuals whose bodies would be displayed as warnings. Indigenous accounts from the Florentine Codex describe the scene. The Spaniards and their allies then fell upon them, and the slaughter was great and cruel. and the dogs attacked them, biting and tearing them. But the aftermath proved even more calculated. Cortés ordered that bodies killed by the dogs not be cremated according to traditional Mesoamerican customs. Instead, they were left in the plaza for 3 days, partially consumed by the animals, visible to anyone who entered the city. The message was clear. The Spanish could not only kill, but could deny enemies even the dignity of proper death rites. Incident 4. The Named Killers. November 1519 to June 1520. As Spanish forces advanced toward and eventually occupied Tenochtitlan, certain war dogs gained individual reputations that terrified the indigenous population. These animals were given names, treated as soldiers, and even awarded shares of captured gold. Becerrillo, a reddish mastiff belonging to Captain Sancho de Aragon, became the most famous. Spanish accounts credit him with killing dozens of indigenous warriors. But more than his kill count, Becerrillo seemed to possess an uncanny ability to distinguish between hostile indigenous people and those allied with the Spanish. Handlers claimed he would attack enemies but spare allies on command. Contemporary accounts describe Becerrillo as receiving a crossbowman's share of all captured gold and treasure, an extraordinary honor that elevated the dog to near-human status in Spanish eyes, while making him a demon figure to indigenous people. Another dog, Leoncico, belonged to Vasco Núñez de Balboa and later served in the Conquest campaigns. Spanish records state that Leoncico earned a lieutenant's pay, more than standard soldiers received. These named dogs became psychological weapons in themselves. Indigenous forces knew the dogs by reputation and feared specific animals by name. Spanish commanders exploited this, sometimes simply threatening to release Becerrillo to achieve compliance from indigenous leaders. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The descent into darkness goes much deeper. Share this with someone who needs to understand the calculated brutality of conquest. Let's discover what happens when the dogs reach the heart of the Aztec Empire. November 8, 1519. Cortés entered Tenochtitlan as a guest of Emperor Moctezuma II. The Spanish force, including their war dogs, was housed in the palace of Axayacatl, a sprawling complex in the heart of the Aztec capital. What Cortés and his men discovered during their occupation would reveal the true extent of the war dog's psychological impact and the depth of Spanish strategic depravity. In the palace storerooms, Spanish soldiers found what they initially believed were provisions, dried meat, carefully preserved and stored in pottery vessels. As they examined the stores more closely, they realized the truth. These weren't standard provisions. Some pieces still bore distinctive features, fingers, portions of limbs prepared and preserved. But these weren't Aztec stores. They were Spanish. The dog handlers had been systematically preserving portions of killed indigenous people to maintain their animals' taste for human flesh. The discovery came to light when several Spanish soldiers, horrified by the practice, reported it to Cortés's second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado. According to a letter from the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who later interviewed witnesses, the handlers maintained this supply deliberately. The dogs, one handler allegedly explained, must not forget the taste, lest they become docile and useless in battle. But the more profound discovery came from captured Aztec documents, pictographic records that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. These codices revealed that Aztec intelligence networks had tracked every incident involving the war dogs. They had documented kills, noted patterns, and attempted to develop countermeasures. The Aztecs had tried everything. Warriors attempted to use obsidian-bladed weapons to slice at the dogs' unarmored legs and bellies. They tried using atlatl darts, spear-throwing weapons, to strike dogs at range. They attempted to create barriers using wooden stakes. Nothing worked consistently. The dogs were too fast, too heavily armored in their cotton vests, and too well protected by Spanish soldiers who understood their psychological value. More chilling was what the codices revealed about indigenous morale. Aztec warriors who had faced horses could rationalize those encounters, large animals that could be killed with proper tactics. But the dogs represented something that violated their understanding of nature. The codices included imagery showing warriors fleeing from relatively small numbers of dogs while standing firm against much larger Spanish forces. The psychological impact became quantifiable when modern historians analyzed casualty records. In battles where war dogs were deployed, Aztec forces broke and fled at significantly higher rates than in encounters without dogs, even when the Aztecs possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. During the Spanish occupation of Tenochtitlan, Aztec leaders secretly approached allied indigenous groups, asking if they knew of any way to counter the war beasts. They received no useful intelligence. The dogs were unprecedented in Mesoamerican experience. Then, on June 30, 1520, came La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Aztec forces, enraged by Spanish massacres and the death of Moctezuma II, drove the conquistadors from Tenochtitlan in a devastating nocturnal battle. Spanish casualties were catastrophic, over 600 soldiers killed, along with thousands of indigenous allies, and many of the war dogs died that night. Aztec warriors, fighting in their own city with tactical advantage, specifically targeted the animals. They surrounded dogs and used coordinated spear attacks. They trapped them in narrow streets and used weight of numbers. By morning, perhaps half the war dogs were dead. But when Spanish forces regrouped and Spanish military scribe Bernardino de Sahagún later interviewed Aztec warriors about the battle, he discovered something unexpected. Even in victory, the indigenous warriors described killing the dogs with terror in their voices. Multiple warriors reported that killing a war dog required more courage than killing a Spanish soldier. Several described having nightmares about the animals months after the battle. The dogs had achieved something remarkable. Even in death, they maintained their psychological dominance. The systematic use of war dogs in the conquest of the Aztec Empire didn't end with La Noche Triste. Instead, it intensified. After regrouping in Tlaxcala, Cortés spent months building a larger force for his return to Tenochtitlan. He imported more war dogs from Cuba and Hispaniola. Spanish sources indicate he had between 30 and 50 dogs by the time he began his siege of Tenochtitlan in May 1521. The 13-week siege that followed became one of history's most devastating military campaigns. Cut off from fresh water and supplies, suffering from smallpox epidemics, facing Spanish firearms and cavalry, the Aztecs fought with desperate courage. Contemporary estimates suggest 100,000 to 240,000 Aztec civilians and warriors died during the siege. The war dogs were used systematically throughout. Spanish battle accounts describe releasing dogs during assaults on Aztec defensive positions. The animals would charge ahead of Spanish infantry, creating panic and breaking defensive formations. Indigenous allies fighting alongside the Spanish reported that Aztec warriors would sometimes abandon strong defensive positions when they saw dogs being brought forward. But the dogs served another purpose during the siege: terror enforcement among the Spanish allied indigenous forces. Multiple accounts describe dogs being used to execute indigenous allies suspected of communicating with the Aztecs, or of insufficient commitment to the Spanish cause. The message to allied warriors was clear: fail to fight enthusiastically enough, and you might be fed to the beasts. When Tenochtitlan finally fell on August 13, 1521, the war dogs were present at the final surrender. Spanish chroniclers describe Cortés having dogs stationed near him as the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was brought forward in chains. The symbolic message was unmistakable. Even in defeat, the Spanish maintained their instruments of terror. The legal reckoning that never came what followed should have been legal accountability. It wasn't. The Spanish crown maintained complex legal frameworks for conquest, derived from medieval just war theory, and constantly elaborated by theologians and jurists. The Requerimiento, a document that Spanish conquistadors were required to read to indigenous people before attacking, theoretically provided legal justification for conquest while demanding indigenous people submit to Spanish authority and Christianity. But nowhere in these legal frameworks was there explicit authorization for the use of war dogs, particularly the practice of feeding them on human flesh. The issue came to head in 1542, when Bartolomé de las Casas published his explosive work Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. Las Casas, a former conquistador turned Dominican friar and bishop, had become the Spanish Empire's most prominent critic of conquest atrocities. His work included detailed accounts of war dogs. He wrote, "I saw all the above things and countless others, and since all the people who could have testified to them have been killed, I put down in writing what I saw. The Spaniards made a rule among themselves that for every Christian slain by the Indians, they would slay 100 Indians. They had dogs trained to kill and tear the Indians to pieces at first sight like savage lions." Las Casas's work sparked intense debate at the Spanish court. The result was the new laws of 1542, which theoretically reformed Spanish colonial administration and outlawed the most extreme abuses. The laws prohibited enslaving indigenous people and required more humane treatment, but the new laws said nothing explicit about war dogs. Why? Because Spanish military commanders argued, and the crown accepted, that war dogs were legitimate military assets, no different from horses or weapons. The practice of feeding them human flesh was defended as necessary military conditioning. Several conquistadors testified that without such conditioning, the dogs would be useless in battle. The Spanish crown, dependent on New World gold and silver, chose pragmatism over principle. No conquistador was ever prosecuted for crimes involving war dogs. No handler faced charges. The practice continued for decades across Spanish America. The practice spreads, if anything. The documented success of war dogs in the Aztec conquest led to their expanded use throughout the Americas. In Peru, Francisco Pizarro employed similar tactics against the Inca Empire. Dogs were used in the execution of Inca nobles and in battles against indigenous resistance. The psychological impact proved just as devastating in the Andes as it had in Mexico. In Florida, Hernando de Soto's expedition used war dogs against indigenous peoples throughout the southeast. Contemporary accounts describe dogs being used not just in battle but in systematic terror campaigns against villages. In the conquest of the Maya territories of Yucatan and Guatemala, which extended from the 1520s through the 1540s, war dogs remained standard equipment. The Maya, who had received reports about the dogs decades before Spanish forces reached their territory, nonetheless proved just as vulnerable to the psychological impact. The practice even spread to Spanish conflict with other European powers. When the Spanish fought Protestant heretics in the Netherlands during the 80 Years' War, several commanders deployed dogs against civilian populations with tactics learned in the Americas. What happened to the dogs? The famous war dogs of the conquest rarely survived long. Combat injuries, tropical diseases, and the sheer physical toll of repeated battles killed most within a few years of arriving in the New World. Becerrillo, the most famous war dog of the conquest, died around 1521 during operations in Puerto Rico. According to Spanish accounts, he was struck by a poison arrow during a battle against the Taino people. His handler reportedly wept at the dog's death and gave him a Christian burial, an honor rarely extended to indigenous people killed in Spanish conquests. Becerrillo's son, Leoncico, continued his father's reputation, serving in Central American campaigns through the 1520s. He too was eventually awarded a soldier's share of plunder, and lived to old age as an honored veteran. But most war dogs died unmourned, unnamed, and unremarked in Spanish records. They were tools that wore out and were replaced. The trauma that echoed the true aftermath of the war dogs appeared in indigenous culture and memory. For centuries after the conquest, Mesoamerican communities maintained deep-seated fear of large dogs. Colonial-era Mexican documents record indigenous people avoiding Spanish-owned dogs, even decades after the conquest when the animals were clearly domesticated pets. Several indigenous rebellions in the 16th and 17th centuries specifically targeted Spanish dogs, killing them in revenge attacks. Modern anthropologists and historians studying post-conquest indigenous cultures have identified what might be called intergenerational trauma. Oral histories collected in the 19th and 20th centuries from indigenous communities in Mexico and Central America continued to reference the conquest-era war dogs with fear and horror. Centuries after the last war dog had died, the dogs had achieved something no conquistador individually could. They had created lasting, multi-generational, psychological scars in indigenous consciousness. The story of the Conquistador wa. Our dogs reveals uncomfortable truths about conquest, warfare, and the calculated use of terror as a military strategy. The weaponization of psychology. Modern military strategists recognize what Cortés understood intuitively. Battlefield success depends as much on psychological domination as on tactical superiority. The war dogs represented perhaps the first systematic use of a weapon designed primarily for its psychological rather than its tactical impact. Consider the numbers. In a typical battle involving hundreds or thousands of warriors, the actual casualties caused directly by war dogs were probably minimal, perhaps dozens of deaths. But the psychological impact affected entire armies. Aztec forces numbering in the thousands broke and fled from Spanish units that included only a handful of dogs. This represents a psychological force multiplier that military theorists would not formally conceptualize until the 20th century. Modern military doctrine explicitly discusses shock and awe tactics, the use of overwhelming dramatic force to paralyze enemy decision-making and break the will to resist. Cortés pioneered this approach 500 years ago using dogs. Dehumanization as strategy. The war dogs also exemplify how conquest requires dehumanizing the conquered. The handlers who trained dogs to hunt indigenous people specifically, who fed them on human flesh, who staged hunts using prisoners. These men had to construct elaborate psychological frameworks to justify their actions. Spanish colonial documents reveal these frameworks. Indigenous people were described as bestial, savage, and lacking rational souls. Some Spanish theologians seriously debated whether indigenous Americans were fully human. In this context, using dogs against them became morally acceptable to the conquistadors. You're just using beasts against beasts. This dehumanization wasn't accidental, it was necessary. The conquistadors needed to see indigenous people as fundamentally different, as something less than human, to justify the scale of violence they inflicted. The war dogs both reflected and reinforced this dehumanization, the evolution of colonial violence. The use of war dogs in the Americas set precedents that echoed through centuries of colonial expansion. European powers would deploy similar tactics across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The British used dogs in their conquests of India and Africa. The French employed them in Algeria and Indochina. The Americans used dogs against Native Americans and later in the Philippines. Each colonial power learned from Spanish precedents, not just the tactical use of dogs but the psychological strategy of employing unprecedented, culturally alien forms of violence to shatter indigenous resistance. Moreover, the war dogs established a template for colonial violence, the use of weapons or tactics that were not just militarily effective but culturally traumatic. European colonizers repeatedly deployed technologies and practices that violated indigenous cultural frameworks, weapons that made specific sounds, tactics that disrupted sacred spaces, punishments that denied traditional death rites. The war dogs were the prototype. What changed, and what didn't? The Spanish Crown's new laws of 1542 theoretically reformed colonial administration. In practice, they changed relatively little. The use of war dogs continued for decades. Indigenous people continued to be enslaved under different legal fictions. The violence continued. But Las Casas's writings did something important. They established a tradition of internal critique within colonial powers. Future colonial abuses would face organized opposition from religious figures, humanitarians, and eventually human rights advocates. This tradition of dissent, however ineffective in preventing atrocities, created historical records that preserved accounts of violence that perpetrators would have preferred to hide. The war dog accounts survived primarily because critic, like Las Casas, documented them. Without such documentation, the systematic use of dogs might have been minimized or forgotten in official histories that preferred to portray the conquest as a civilizing mission. Modern parallels: we might prefer to think that the calculated cruelty of the conquistador war dogs represents a distant historical aberration. It doesn't. Modern conflicts continue to employ tactics designed primarily for psychological impact. Torture, rape as a weapon of war, destruction of cultural sites, public executions, all serve the same strategic purpose as the war dogs: to shatter the enemy's psychological certainty, to create terror that outlasts the immediate battlefield. The 20th century saw industrial-scale applications of such tactics. Nazi Germany's systematic dehumanization and genocide, the use of nuclear weapons against civilian populations, ethnic cleansing campaigns from Armenia to Rwanda to the Balkans, all employed the same fundamental strategy: use forms of violence so extreme, so unprecedented, that they break the victim's will to resist and create lasting trauma in survivor populations. The question of accountability, perhaps most troubling, is the lack of accountability. No conquistador faced justice for crimes involving war dogs. The handlers, the commanders who ordered their deployment, the soldiers who participated in feeding them human flesh, all escaped punishment. This pattern repeats throughout history. Architects of colonial violence rarely face legal consequences. From the Congo Free State to the Herero genocide to Abu Ghraib, those who design and implement systematic atrocities typically evade accountability, protected by distance, power, and the legal fictions their own governments create. The conquistador war dogs represent an extreme case of a common phenomenon: violence that everyone knows is wrong but that serves powerful interests and therefore continues, justified by elaborate legal and moral frameworks that collapse under scrutiny, but survive through institutional support. What do you think drove Spanish conquistadors to develop such calculated methods of terror? Was it purely strategic necessity, or does the use of war dogs reveal something darker about the psychology of conquest? Leave your theories in the comments below, and if you know of similar historical examples of psychological warfare that shattered entire civilizations, share those as well. This is just one chapter in the larger story of conquest and resistance in the Americas. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the systems of violence that shaped our modern world. Remember to hit that notification bell so you never miss an investigation into history's darkest corners. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters in history weren't supernatural. They were human, and they kept detailed records.